Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. Happy Halloween. I'm wearing orange to be festive today. And also I'm quite happy to be back in the studio, back in Athens. I want to talk today about SpaceX that I haven't talked about as much recently, but this is a really interesting article. We get some confirmation of some things that we suspected might be true, get some new tidbits, and then the big question I want to ask at the end is why did they write this article? I think this is a very valuable question to ask at this point because there's some stuff that's going on, and I think it's fairly clear when you read the totality of this update who their primary audience is. So anyway, October 30th, which was yesterday, to the moon and beyond. So of course they start off with the big vision. Humanity is at an inflection point. For the first time in our existence, we possess the means, technology, and for the moment, the will to establish a permanent human presence beyond the Earth. So that's something very important to remember, and I think we should put this in the list of data for who is SpaceX actually ultimately writing this blog for. Now, obviously, it's a public blog. All of us can see it, but I think there's a very specific audience here. And then, of course, they defend why Starship is the best option, even though there has been a lot of question about whether it is the best option or not because it is so darn big. Starship is designed to make this future a reality and is singularly capable of carrying unparalleled numbers of explorers and the building blocks they'll need to establish the first outpost. So basically, they're going like its advantage is how big it is rather than being a disadvantage. They're saying that is an advantage, which of course many people argue for. I'm not arguing for or against that, but I'm just saying they're clearly pitching this as, hey, it's extra big, so that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And of course, they're discussing here outposts on the moon, not just going to the moon, planting a flag, and leaving again, but actually sticking around. For these reasons and more, it, or human landing system, the Starship human landing system, was chosen to fulfill the key role of landing the first astronauts on the moon in more than 50 years. It will be a central enabler that will fulfill the vision of NASA's Artemis program, which seeks to establish a lasting presence on the lunar surface, not just flags and footprints, and ultimately forge the path to land the first humans on Mars, which we all know is what Elon Musk really wants, is not the moon so much as Mars, but the moon is a pretty good test ground and it's a whole lot closer than Mars, so it's really good to test out technology and all of that kind of thing on the moon first. And plus the fact, of course, that NASA and the US government is very much interested in going to the moon, so a good idea to go to the moon first, and there is political will to go to the moon, at least at the moment. With the scale of Starship and the technological breakthroughs it is engineered to achieve, SpaceX is moving at a historically rapid pace. It doesn't feel like that today, but they actually are going very, very quickly with this. Starship provides unmatched capability to explore the moon thanks to its large size and the ability to refill propellant in space. That is an untested, although there is some interesting data in this blog, but at least at full scale, that is untested at this point, is the refill process. And then some context, which we know about, but of course is helpful for the more general audience. One single Starship has a pressurized habitable volume of more than 600 cubic meters, which is roughly 2/3 the pressurized volume of the entire International Space Station. Pretty cool. You can launch 2/3 of the International Space Station's volume in one single launch. That's very, very impressive. And is complete with a cabin that can be scaled for large numbers of explorers and dual airlocks. That's interesting. I did not know about that. For surface exploration. For comparison, each of Starship's 2 airlocks have a habitable volume of approximately 13 cubic meters, which is more than double the space that was available in the Apollo lander. Now, of course, the Apollo lander was famously utterly tiny. It was the size of a phone booth and you put 2 people inside it. So double the room just means that it's a little more comfortable than that, but that is just an airlock. It's not actually the lander, and there's 2 of them. So that makes it much more reasonable to get in and out of the spaceship because you have to sit there for a long time. Most people don't realize this, but you actually have to depressurize yourself and breathe pure oxygen for a period of time before you're able to go outside of a spaceship because the pressure is so low, you would get the bends. Just as if you were coming up from scuba diving at a low depth too quickly, you would get the bends. You'd get nitrogen bubbles in your joints, which could potentially kill you even. The same thing can happen when you're going out of a spaceship onto the surface of a planet, and these airlocks are necessary because you're probably not going to want to depressurize the entire cabin. 600 cubic meters worth of living space, habitable living space, so you need these airlocks to actually be relatively roomy so that people can sit in there for long periods of time as they depressurize. And then, of course, as we know, cargo variants of the Starship lander will be capable of landing up to 100 metric tons directly on the surface, including large payloads. And that is an interesting aspect of this. You don't have to origami stuff. You can actually just put big things in there, like unpressurized rovers, pressurized rovers, in other words, vehicles to drive around on, nuclear reactors for power, and lunar habitats. So that is, in all honesty, a huge advantage the Starship has. You don't have to origami this stuff or put it together in the vacuum of space. It can just come pre-assembled assembled, and you lower it down to the surface, and there it is. And then SpaceX talks about the two paths that they're going down. Now, this is not two independent paths. This is two parallel paths that both have to happen. To return Americans to the moon, SpaceX aligns Starship development along two paths: development of the core Starship system and supporting infrastructure, including production facilities, test facilities, and launch sites, which SpaceX is self-funding, representing over 90% of system costs. And that, of course, is all the stuff that we have seen. That's building Mechazilla. It's building the stage 0 with the chopsticks and all that stuff. It's building the Super Heavy. It's building the Starships. It's launching them on suborbital trajectories. It's testing all of this stuff out. This is all stuff that is self-funded by SpaceX. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They think that this is a NASA contract, but this is actually SpaceX self-funding this, which takes a remarkable amount of money and a remarkable amount of willpower to do. So, kudos to SpaceX for doing this on their own. And then path 2, or the second half of this, and development of the HLS specific Starship configuration, which leverages and modifies the core vehicle capability to support NASA's requirements for landing crew on and returning them from the moon. And that, of course, is this picture here, which is Starship, but modified quite a bit because it doesn't have its fins, doesn't have the heat shields, it's got little landing legs, and of course it's got a big-ass elevator. This thing that goes down to the surface and allows people and equipment and everything to go from this very, very high up point, because this is all fuel tanks down here. So the habitable space is up here at the top. You got a long ways to go to get down there. And of course, that's a major disadvantage to the Starship system, is that you have to have an elevator to get down. You can't just take the stairs, but as long as the elevator is working, everything is cool. But they'll clearly have to develop some sort of emergency type of capability to get back into the spacecraft if the elevator decides to crap out on them. The other thing that's a little bit scary, of course, is the fact that you've only got these little stick landing legs and the thing is really tall, so it could very easily tip over. But they talk about that later on in the blog, so we will continue on. So as SpaceX says, SpaceX is working under a fixed price contract with NASA, in other words, not cost plus, ensuring the company is only paid after the successful completion of progress milestones, and they're going to talk about that a little bit later, and American taxpayers are not on the hook for increased SpaceX costs. So again, put that in the data bucket. I think it's becoming very clear who they are writing this for, who the primary audience is for here. SpaceX provides significant insight to NASA at every stage of the development process along both paths, including access to flight data from missions not funded under the HLS contract. In other words, the missions that they've been flying, the suborbital missions and stuff, they've been sharing data with NASA, which clearly they don't have to because it's a private enterprise. They don't have to share that with NASA, but they are. Both pathways are necessary and made possible by SpaceX's substantial self-investments to enable the high-rate production, launch, and test of Starship for missions to the moon and other purposes. Interesting. Starship will bring the United States back to the moon before any other nation, and that's a clear shot at China right there. And it will enable sustainable lunar operations by being fully and rapidly reusable, cost-effective, and capable of high-frequency lunar missions with more than 100 tons of cargo capability. So high-frequency, reusable, cheap, lots of cargo capability, lots of volume, so you don't have to fold the things up. So there's big advantages to this human landing system for sure. All right, so part 1, the core Starship system. Since Starship Flight 1 in April 23, which is hard to believe that's 2.5 years ago, wow, SpaceX has rapidly advanced vehicle development through an active flight test campaign. In line with past vehicle development, SpaceX maximizes real-world testing throughout this process to quickly and safely demonstrate capabilities, identify areas for improvement, and prove out solutions. This campaign has quickly matured the core Starship and has produced numerous feats, including multiple successful ascents of the world's most powerful rocket, that would be Super Heavy, the launch, return, catch, and reuse of that rocket to unlock the high launch rate cadence needed for lunar missions. Now that is not completely proven out yet, but they're getting there, right? And this part is interesting here. The transfer of approximately 5 metric tons of cryogenic propellant between tanks while in space, a first of its kind operation that provides key data for future full-scale propellant. So this is something I did not know about, at least, but clearly internal to Starship, they have made propellant transfers between tanks. Now this is inside one spacecraft, not multiple ones. They haven't docked and done all of this stuff yet, but they've transferred the propellant between tanks, and that's no small feat. In microgravity, this stuff just floats around, right? It's not sitting at the bottom of a glass, it's not like down here, it's floating around and filling it all. So it's quite challenging to try to figure out how to transfer propellant when it's not just sitting at the bottom. You can't put a sump at the bottom and just suck it all out. So you have to be a lot more tricky in terms of transferring things. And also they say this is cryogenic. So this would be the liquid oxygen, which of course is even more complicated because it's very, very cold at the same time. And then of course, as we know, successful in-space relights of the Raptor engine. Those are those really quick bursts that they do to prove that they could deorbit the craft, or of course you'd have a longer burst to go to the moon or something. And of course, as we've seen, including this picture up here, multiple controlled re-entries through Earth's atmosphere. Then we get some nice stats here. SpaceX has produced more than 3 dozen Starships and 600 Raptor rocket engines. That is absolutely crazy. With more than 226,000 seconds of runtime on the Raptor 2 engine, so that is a huge amount, and more than 40,000 seconds of runtime on the next-gen Raptor 3 engine. So that is also very impressive. That's a lot of time that they have burned these engines. There have been 11 Starship-only flights, so those were the ones with Starship that would just launch and come back down again, and of course 11 integrated flight tests of Starship and the Super Heavy booster. In parallel, SpaceX has constructed and continues to construct new Starship launch, production, integration, and test facilities in Texas, Florida, and California. So those are the big launch towers and all of that kind of stuff, integration facilities, test facilities, all of that. This private investment of billions of dollars is creating more than 5 million square feet of manufacturing and integration space, 5 launch pads across Texas and Florida, and multiple Raptor test stands, all engineered to ramp Starship's launch cadence above and beyond the paradigm redefining rate achieved by SpaceX's Falcon program. So even though we're seeing lots and lots of rapid reuse of Falcon boosters and everything, the Starship program is going to dwarf that. Next up is the lander, and I just want to pause for a moment to look at this beautiful little shot here. This would be the airlock, and potentially this is the airlock. I'm not sure. Maybe this is the exit to the external, the outside universe here, and this is just the airlock, and the interior space is in here, or this is the end of a hallway or something. This is the entrance to the airlock. I'm not exactly sure which, but anyway, a lot of modern, really cool stuff where you can actually see the Starship on the moon, got control buttons, you've got some place to put your phone and all of those kind of things where you're waiting around. But anyway, lots of really cool stuff in this image. All right, so talking about Path 2, in parallel to development of the core Starship vehicle, SpaceX's HLS team has completed 49 milestones, that is a lot, tied to developing the subsystems, infrastructure, and operations needed to land astronauts on the moon. SpaceX has received money only on contractual milestones that have been successfully completed, the vast majority of which have been achieved on time or ahead of schedule. So that's really, really cool that they have been able to do that. So some of these achievements listed out here: lunar environmental control and life support and thermal control system demonstration. So that's a good idea. If you can't keep people alive, it doesn't really matter how well your ship does. As they say here, they were using a full-scale cabin module inhabited by multiple people. So that's interesting. So it wasn't just one person in there, but multiple people, to test the capability to inject oxygen and nitrogen into the cabin environment and accurately manage air distribution and sanitation. I'm not sure if that means waste stuff like human waste and everything, or if that's just atmospheric waste and stuff. So not exactly sure. It sounds like it's more about breathing air. And so sanitation would be scrubbing out carbon dioxide and other nuisance chemicals that would be exhaled by human beings, along with humidity and thermal control in this system. The test series also measured the acoustic environments inside the cabin. So interesting, to make sure it wouldn't get too loud, I guess, or something along those lines. Next up is docking adapter qualification of the docking system that will link Starship and Orion in space, an androgynous SpaceX docking system capable of serving as the active system or passive system, so that's the androgynous part, and based on the flight-proven Dragon 2 active docking system. So really interesting that they're using Dragon 2 here. I don't know if that's an official NASA acceptance or if SpaceX is just like, this is what we're going to use. You guys are going to have to figure it out yourself, or if that was designed such that it would automatically work with the Orion system. If you know the answer to that, let me know in the comments. Next up, and this is interesting based on, when we looked at that picture of how tall Starship is and how dinky the legs are, this part is important. Landing leg drop test of a full-scale article, so that's a big boy right there if it's a full-scale article, at flight energies onto simulated lunar regolith. So they were probably dropping it at horizontal speeds and things too, instead of just straight vertical down, to make sure that it didn't tip over, stuff like that, to verify system performance and study foot-to regolith interaction. So the lunar regolith, of course, is a kind of fine powdery thing with a lot of sharp edges and stuff, and you want to make sure that the landing legs, I guess, especially if they're coming in sideways, don't stick, don't slide too much, all of that kind of stuff. So very interesting that they have done this testing. This is the first, at least I had heard of that. Next up, Raptor lunar landing throttle test, demonstrating a representative thrust profile that would allow Starship to land on the lunar surface. So of course you've got to be able to deep throttle these things for the Starship to come down. It's very, very light on the lunar surface because it's only 1/6 of the gravity, but it's also in a vacuum. Interestingly enough, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that they couldn't use the Raptor engines because they're on the bottom because it would create such a big crater or something. So unless they're able to only use one Raptor engine at a time and deep throttle it, or maybe they can use multiple ones, but they can deep throttle them very, very low to sort of create a more broad-based crater rather than a small one. I'm not exactly sure, but I had heard at some point that they might actually put engines up at the top so that they're far away from the regolith so that they don't interact with that so much. But it sounds like SpaceX is committed to using the Raptor engines on the bottom of the craft to land, and that it creates an interesting problem because they're going to have a lot of dust and stuff that's going to be kicked up and potentially create a situation where the landing legs have to interact with potentially things below the regolith. So it'll be really interesting when we get to the point where these craft actually land on the moon to see what happens, because that will be a quite complex interaction between the exhaust plumes and the surface of the moon. Next up, micrometeoroid and orbital debris testing of shielding, insulation, and window panels. And of course, they analyze different material stack-ups that will be used to protect Starship from impact hazards and harsh thermal conditions. And then we turn to software ends of things, which, is important too. Don't screw up the software. Landing software, sensor, and radar demonstrations, testing navigation and sensing hardware and software that will be used by Starship to locate and safely descend to a precise landing site on the moon, and software architecture review to define the schematic of major vehicle control processes, what physical computers they will run on, which is something you don't think about that often, but are you going to use radiation hardened chips that NASA has used for decades that are very, very slow compared to modern chips, or are you going to create multiple redundant systems with modern chips that aren't radiation hardened, put them inside Faraday cages and stuff? That's really interesting questions. What specific hardware are you going to use? And then of course, what software can you run on that? Answering all of those questions is critically important to creating a system that actually works. And then of course, software functions for critical systems like fault detection, caution, warning alerts, and command and telemetry control. So just like the Apollo guidance system that was able to reboot really quickly when they had the 1201 and 1202 alarms, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were landing on the moon in Apollo 11, you want a system that's able to handle critical faults in a tolerant way and recover from them and continue landing instead of crashing. That, of course, would be a disastrous situation you want to avoid at all costs. And then, of course, Raptor cold start demonstrations, which means chilling the Raptor engines down as if they've been sitting in space cold and firing them up again to see how they'll do under those circumstances, using both sea level and vacuum optimized Raptor engines. I'm not exactly sure why they would care about the sea level stuff for in space, but I guess because it gimbals, they probably need to have that kind of control, that are pre-chilled prior to startup to simulate the thermal conditions experienced after an extended time in space. And we still have several more of these milestones, so you can see they've hit a lot of big milestones here. Integrated lunar mission operations plan review, so that's kind of the big picture stuff, covering how SpaceX and NASA will conduct integrated operations since they will have to work together, develop flight rules and crew procedures, and the high-level mission operation plan. Also, depot power module demonstration, testing prototype electrical power generation and distribution systems planned to be used on the propellant depot variant of Starship. So they'll have another version of the Starship that will launch with just propellant in it, and you'll have to transfer that to the primary vehicle before you send it off to the moon because it needs all of its propellant just to get to orbit. So it'll basically be empty at that point. So you can't just fire this thing off and go straight to the moon. With the Starship, you've got to refuel it in orbit, which is a pretty critical part of things, which SpaceX has not fully demonstrated yet, but they are planning on doing it in 2026, as they say in just a moment. Then they've got radio testing and things like that. And of course, very critically, they've got elevator and airlock demonstration. We saw how tall that elevator was, and also it's very, very necessary. If it fails, how do you get back on the ship if you're down on the ground? Anyway, interestingly, they conducted this in concert with Axiom, so that's Axiom Space, to utilize flight representative pressurized EVA suits to practice full operation of the crew elevator, which will be used to transfer crew and cargo between Starship and the lunar surface. And then they did medical system demonstrations or tests covering crew medical systems on Starship and telemedicine capability between the ground and the crew. That's important, especially if you're going to be there for a long period of time. Somebody could easily get sick, get appendicitis, something like that, and you have to deal with that remotely with a doctor on Earth, probably either doing telemedicine or guiding someone who has medical training on the lunar surface. And then finally, hardware-in-the-loop testbed activation for the propellant transfer flight test, which uses a testbed with flight representative hardware to run simulations for the upcoming propellant transfer flight test. And then next steps, and again, I want to pause on this image, which is very cool. It's a top down from the top of the craft, looking at how darn spacious this all is. Very much 2001 A Space Odyssey kind of thing, right? Except it's not spinning, so he's not going around the outside. But it's that kind of a thing. You've got this big circular thing. You've got lots and lots of room. These guys apparently are just in chairs. This looks a little bit like Star Trek, where they're just sitting in chairs instead of things that are bolted down. But I guess that's how it would work when you were actually sitting on the moon. It's not going to have like earthquakes or move around or anything, so you can just have chairs that you can just move to wherever you need to move them to utilize them in any configuration you wish. And then a ton of screens and things like that that people will interact with. So continuing on here, while many of SpaceX's remaining HLS contract milestones are tied to flight tests, such as ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstrations, yeah, so that's an important one, SpaceX has started fabricating a flight article Starship HLS cabin, so that's the whole cabin, that will include functional avionics and power systems, crew systems and mechanisms, environmental control and life support systems, cabin and crew communication systems, and a cabin thermal control system. So basically, it sounds like it's not going to actually be in a Starship, but it'll be like the top portion of the Starship where the people would be, and it's going to be a full flight testable article. So everything should work except for the fact that you can't put it in space. This flight-capable cabin will enable engineers to demonstrate high design maturity of the various systems required to support a human landing on the moon, enable integrated system-level hardware testing, and provide a highly realistic training experience for future lunar explorers. So that's really, really cool. People will be able to utilize this thing and get the feel for how the ship is going to work. And then, of course, we've got this video of the propellant transfer going on in Earth orbit here. The next major flight milestones tied specifically to human landing system will be a long-duration flight test and the in-space propellant transfer flight test. So they'll put Starship in orbit and they will leave it there for a period of time. And then, of course, they'll have to do the propellant transfer as well. The exact timing will be driven by how upcoming flight tests debuting the new Starship version 3 architecture progress, which again, that's brand new, so we haven't seen that fly yet. But both of these tests are targeted to take place in 2026, so within the next year. On-orbit refueling enables Starship to complete the Artemis lunar mission architecture and carry up to 100 tons directly to the lunar surface. So again, it's contingent on this refueling process working, providing the capability to carry rovers, habitats, and other payloads needed to establish a permanent and sustainable presence on the moon. This will all start with a Starship launched from Starbase to spend an extended time in orbit gathering data on vehicle propulsion and thermal behavior on an extended duration mission, including long-duration propellant storage and boil-off characterization. Remember, especially for the liquid oxygen, that is cryogenic and it's going to want to boil away. So they need to look at how much loss there is per day or per week or something like that. But they can put the Starship into orbit and leave it there for a long time and gather a bunch of data on how it does in space over a long period of time. A second Starship will then launch to rendezvous with the first. So in other words, this will be very much like the Gemini 7 and 8. I think it was 7 and 8 missions that went up. But the one, I believe it was actually Gemini 8 was the one that was up for a long time. I might be misremembering the numbers. But anyway, the one was up there for like 2 weeks and the other one launched and came and rendezvoused with it and then went back down again. So the same kind of idea here, except that the second Starship will then launch to rendezvous with the first and will actually transfer propellant. And then here's a little interesting factoid. Starship V3 vehicles come equipped with docking ports and can be configured to act as tanker vehicles with the addition of docking probes. So they will have that built in, and the tanker version just requires adding these sort of, I guess, mail probes or something like that to what's already there on the basic Starship configuration. So that's really, really cool that it's just sort of built in and they don't have to build out some other infrastructure to make this all work. Starship also has a connection point where propellants are loaded onto the vehicle in preparation for launch that has been updated to enable on-orbit propellant transfer. So that also is very important. For rendezvous, Starships will be equipped with Dragon Eye navigation sensors, which have extensive flight heritage from their use on SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft during dozens of dockings to the International Space Station. Of course, we have seen that all happen many, many times. These sensors have undergone separate testing to characterize their performance for use on Starship. SpaceX has also been flying experimental propellant gauging sensors on every recent Starship flight test, so that's interesting to know, which use radio frequency measurements to accurately measure propellant levels while in microgravity. So I assume it's some sort of Doppler system where they're bouncing radar off of the propellant and seeing how full the tank is. Now, of course, in microgravity, again, like I said, it's not sitting at the bottom of the tank like this. It's actually floating around the whole tank. So unless they're using ullage motors to sort of push the craft a little bit and settle the propellant to the bottom of the tank, I don't know exactly how this works. So it would be very interesting to find out. Again, if anybody knows the details about this, definitely let me know in the comments, because it would be really interesting to know how they're actually using this to measure the volume of propellant that still is available in the craft in microgravity. And then finally, we get to the Vision, a permanent return. NASA selected Starship in 2021 to serve as the lander for Artemis 3 mission and return humans to the moon for the first time since Apollo. That selection was made through fair and open competition, again another piece of data here, which determined that SpaceX's bid utilizing Starship had the highest technical and management ratings while being the lowest cost by a wide margin, and that was very, very true. This was followed by a second selection to serve as the lander for Artemis 4, moving beyond initial demonstrations to lay the groundwork that will ensure that humanity's return to the moon is permanent. Starship continues to simultaneously be the fastest path to returning humans to the surface of the moon, hint, hint, Blue Origin, and a core enabler of the Artemis program's goal to establish a permanent, sustainable presence on the lunar surface. SpaceX shares the goal of returning to the moon as expeditiously as possible, approaching the mission with the same alacrity and commitment that returned human spaceflight capability to America under NASA's Commercial Crew Program. So that was a callback, of course, to the SpaceX Dragon capsule being able to go to the International Space Station. Since the HLS contract was awarded, we have been consistently responsive to NASA as requirements for Artemis 3 have changed, and they've changed a lot, and have shared ideas on how to simplify the mission to align with national priorities. In response to the latest calls, we've shared and are formally assessing a simplified mission architecture. So there's been a lot of talk about cutting Artemis, and concept of operations that we believe will result in a faster return to the moon while simultaneously improving crew safety. And then finally, NASA's Artemis program was born out of a visionary goal to truly explore the moon and place the first footprints on Mars, not to repeat the accomplishments of Apollo, not to be another entry in a long list of short-lived exploration initiatives, but to be the opportunity to finally build a sustainable presence on another planet. And of course, Elon always talks about sustainable colony on Mars. This would be a good waypoint on the way towards there. SpaceX was founded to make life multiplanetary, and Starship has been designed from the very beginning to enable the exploration of other worlds. With it, and alongside NASA, hint, hint, we look forward to inspiring all of humanity as that first permanent foothold is placed among the stars. So lots of cool data in this update from SpaceX, but the big question is, why write this particular blog? Why write it this way? I think the answer is very clear. This is written to the US government. This is an open letter to the US government, and in particular NASA. If we recall, Jared Isaacman, who was Elon Musk's pick for NASA administrator, after Elon fell out of favor with the government or whatever happened behind the scenes there, Jared was unfortunately kicked out because I think he would have made an excellent NASA administrator. And we at this point do not have a permanent replacement or a permanent administrator, but we have a temporary one in place who is not as friendly to SpaceX as Jared Isaacman would have been. And then, of course, at the same time, there's a lot of discussion about curtailing Artemis and cutting it all the way back and everything. And so I think that this is very clearly an open letter written to everybody, but specifically designed to put pressure on the US government and on NASA to continue supporting Artemis and to continue supporting SpaceX's involvement in Artemis with the human landing system, as opposed to going another direction. So in my mind, at least, it's pretty clear that that is the target audience, even though all of us get to enjoy a lot of the fruits of that because we get to see some details that at least I didn't know about before with the human landing system and the milestones and all of the cool things that SpaceX has done along the way. Alrighty, folks, that's what I've got for you today. Let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. And while you're down there, if you don't mind liking the video, it really, really helps things out. And consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.